need to go on this or? Okay.
Yeah, I will see.
Thanks, Jess.
I still haven't received the video, but I've got some 3 images.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just show you what you've got.
Yeah.
That's the one. Let's get some music. Yeah, I'll just show that photo and then there's a yeah, but this one, oh, this is
So, I mean, it's not marked.
that's whose boxes.
Yeah. So it's sort of there.
Then there's a video coming, which is my sister's still editing, so Maria will send that to you. And then I think we can ask her to come back.
It's
In the evening.
Oh, poor guy. Right, it must be horrible, that night. Still lost his friend.
Leanne. And Leanne has been confused by
Yes, Dr. Dwyer.
Take a seat, everyone.
I apologise for that delay this morning. We're just getting the live stream technology issues sorted out, but happily that's been done now, thanks to Jess, our court officer, and Patrick, who has assisted us from afar. Before we call our first witness today, might I just deal with some housekeeping matters, Your Honour? As Your Honour knows, we have not yet finished the inquest, but we have been able to secure dates for next year. We have the dates of the 27th of February 2023 through to the 10th of March. So 2 weeks of sittings to hear any additional evidence next year, including Constable Rolfe, a number of senior police officers who are yet to give evidence, for example, including the Assistant Commissioner. So they will be listed at that time. And then the dates of the 26th to the 28th of April are available so that we can use that time for oral submissions from parties. And then Your Honour will, of course, retire after that to consider and then deliver your findings. Your Honour, in between those dates of the last evidence hearings and the oral submission dates, a timetable will be set for written submissions, with counsel assisting going first with written submissions and other parties having an opportunity to reply. And we'll advise of those shortly. The only other additional housekeeping I wanted to note before we call the first witness is that there are a number of outstanding decisions for Your Honour in relation to non-publication orders.
Yes.
And I expect that they, when they become available, when Your Honour has the opportunity to do that, they will then be made available on the website and the relevant parties will be informed. We're also, of course, waiting on the decision of Her Honour Justice Kelly with respect to an appeal that was lodged on behalf of Constable Rolfe and Officer Bowens. And when that decision becomes available, we'll put that on the website for this inquest so that everybody can be kept informed.
Thank you.
I should note also that in the interim period between now and the next hearing dates, of course, myself, Mr. Coleridge and Ms. Walls are available to assist any parties or future witnesses with anything that they need.
Thank you very much. And our first witness, or our final witness for these sittings.
Yes, is a very important one, Your Honour, if I may say, who has some really interesting and important evidence to provide us with, and that is Miss Kerry Ann Chilvers, and I call Miss Chilvers.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Chilvers, before you give any evidence today, do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
I do.
Thank you. Dr. Dwyer.
Miss Chilvers, could you please tell the court your full name?
Kerry Ann Chilvers?
And you're based here in Alice Springs, is that right?
Yes.
What is your current occupation?
I'm a trauma and addiction counsellor with Alcohol and Drug Services Central Australia.
We've got a number of statements that you've provided in order to assist the court. Your Honour, they're found at 8-10, 8-11 and 8-11A.
Thank you.
In those statements, I should say the first is the 17th of June and the second is the 30th of June 2020. They're both very similar.
Yes.
And then you've provided a supplementary statement recently dated the 28th of November.
Correct.
Ms. Chilvers, in your statements, you assist us by setting out your significant qualifications. I won't go through all of your CV, I would be here for a long time, but just so those listening understand some of your qualifications, you are, of course, a trained psychologist, and your current position is a trauma and addiction counsellor with Alcohol and Other Drug Services Central Australia.
Yes.
So your current employee is Northern Territory Health, is that right?
Yes.
You are currently the project lead for integrating trauma-informed practice into those alcohol and drug services, is that
Correct.
right? And you have had a significant amount of training and experience in assisting people who are dealing with intergenerational trauma, is that right?
Correct.
And I'll come back to that shortly, specifically focusing on Kumanjayi and what he was experiencing. You note that you're also co-facilitator for a group therapy program called Be the Boss of Your Feelings.
Yes.
What's that program?
My co-facilitator and Nikki McCoy, who's in the room, it's about through a trauma lens, it's looking at domestic violence and alcohol consumption through a trauma lens. So it's about helping men to understand the link between trauma and their use of substances and violence.
And is that program delivered to men at the correction centre?
Yes.
How long has that program been running for?
We've run the first pilot program of 10 weeks this year, and we plan on running them again next year.
Is that a program that's available outside of Alice Springs at this stage?
No.
Okay. Is it, so the first pilot program this year, and then if there are plans to run that program again next year, is
Yes.
that right? You also run your own private practice, is that right?
Yes.
What is that practice?
I see individual clients, so one-on-one for trauma specialist therapy, somatic experiencing in particular. I'm developing trauma-informed practice training, in the process of that, and it's going to be online training. And I also do consultancy work as requested.
That's the Red Centre Healing.
That's correct.
So in relation to your training work, you are aiming to deliver a model to train people to go out and do that work themselves. Is that right?
Not to be trauma-specific therapists, because that takes a lot of years of training.
Yes.
But more like anybody working with people who've experienced trauma, teaching them how to be trauma-informed in their practice.
Would that trauma inform?
SevGen is an Aboriginal founded organisation in Queensland. It is a social enterprise model, and so they're not funded by government. They encourage people to, through social enterprise, they create money to do good with young people. So they work with young people, and Kumanjayi spent 6 months over there.
In your statement, I'll come to this shortly, you note that Kumanjayi did really well when he was based at SevGen in a structured program.
Yes.
Was that your first involvement with SevGen?
I had met Terry before I went to Yuendamu, so we had done an entrepreneurial training together. That's where we met, and we just sort of connected. So I was staying connected with her, and it was, with Kumanjayi, it was like there was nowhere that he could go that was going to help him. And so I actually reached out to Terry and said, can you help? And she said yes.
It's Terry Waller, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And she ran and still runs the SevGen program.
Yeah, it's not a program.
Okay.
It's more like a philosophy, and it's surrounded with love and respect and valuing culture.
We know that I'll come to this shortly, but when Kumanjayi went up, he actually went with Leanne Oldfield,
That's
one
right.
of his mums, for
Yes.
the whole 6-month period.
And that was the part of their requirement, is that Warlpiri young people. So we created that, or co-created that. That's how the Modern Songlines project came about. And part of Terry's requirement was that the young people come with a family member, a carer. Yeah.
I'll return to that shortly. Can I just start by asking you then about, just before I come to Kumanjayi actually, your history in Yuendamu, because you've had a very long-term connection to the Northern Territory.
Can I take you back to a correction in the affidavit?
Oh, certainly,
yes, thank
sure,
you.
sure. So I think there was something that you reminded me you would like to correct in your most recent affidavit. That's the affidavit
Yes.
of 28th of November 2022.
Yes. And also in the statement on the page 2 of the trauma assessment report, it's written the clinical impression. It's got complex developmental disorder. That should read complex developmental trauma.
Okay. So complex developmental disorder should be replaced by complex developmental trauma.
Correct. Thank you.
And you're referring there to your most recent statement of the 28th of November.
Yes.
And a diagnosis, effectively, that you assist Her Honour with in terms of what Kumanjayi was suffering from.
Correct.
And Your Honour, that's of significance, as Ms Chilvers tells us, so we'll get that corrected before that goes up on the website.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you about your first involvement with Yuendamu?
Yes.
How old were you when you went to Yuendamu?
I was 11 years of age.
And how did that come about?
My mother was a school teacher, and she took my sister, my two sisters and I from Gympie in Queensland out to the middle of nowhere. And yeah, that's how I first came to experience Yuendamu.
Was Gympie where you'd grown up? Is that where
I lived in Brisbane for the first 6 years of my life, but after my father died, we moved to Gympie because that's where my mum's family was.
Okay. And had your mum had any connection with the Northern Territory before she came to Yuendamu?
No, my mum was an adventurous woman.
Okay. So do you know how she came to be working at the school?
I imagine that she applied for a job and she got a job as a teacher at the Yuendamu school.
Okay, so did that mean that you and your siblings were enrolled in the school too?
My mother was the school teacher for all of the Karia kids, and I was in year 7, and my younger sister was at school. I was in year 7 and my older sister was in year 8, so we did distance education, but we were involved in the school. We participated in the school stuff.
And how long did you lived out at Yuendamu for that period, obviously?
Yes.
How long did you live at Yuendamu from when time when you were 11?
So I lived there that year, and then I went away for sporting school, and then I came back in 1980 and my first job was at the big shop in Yuendamu, and I stayed there until sometime during 1981.
Can you tell us, when you were 11 in Yuendamu, do you have a perception of how many people lived in the community?
From memory, I think there was still about 800 people living there. It was still quite a large community, but back then, Yuendamu was established in 1946, so it was only like 30 years old when I went there. And it was very different then to what it is now. It was a real community, and it was the first time in my life I ever got to experience what it was like to be part of a community and have a sense of belonging.
Can you tell her, Honor, what that was like then, when you was a kid?
It was the best year and the happiest year of my life.
When you were there as an 11-year-old, you were meeting Yapa people for the first time?
Yes.
Did you develop strong friendships?
Yes. It was when we first arrived, we were a 17-year-old young Walpuri man knocked on our door by the name of Otto Jungarai Sims, and he took us under his wing and introduced us all to his families, the Spencer family, the Nelson family, and the Sims family. And we spent all of our weekends with the families collecting bush, and they actually provided us with a cultural induction. So they weren't paid to do that, but they just surrounded us with support and love and connection, and we were never broken into. Our car was taken up the street one time, but the community members, you got to come get your car back, and brought our car back. So it was very happy memories, and most of the Aboriginal community members worked. The school had lots of Aboriginal staff, the health clinic had lots of Aboriginal staff, and when I went back to work in the big shop, I worked alongside Alice Granitz, and we sit side by side all day in the checkout chicks, at the big shop. So it was different.
It sounds like for you as a child, it felt like a very safe community.
It was a safe community.
Were you given a skin name when you came to
Yes.
the community? And what did that mean to you?
It's kind of like the skin name puts you in relationship to everybody else, and everybody still calls me by my skin name.
And does that give you a relationship in effect to everybody in the community?
It does.
And so you know how you fit in relation to everybody else, the 800 people in the community?
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
When you came back into community to work, as I'm going to take you to later, in terms of a therapeutic role for WIDAC, did you feel conflicted in any way because you had a skin name?
No.
Can you explain why that is?
I think because my strongest point, my strongest advocacy was for young people, so they were first and foremost.
And you weren't put in any compromising positions as a result of your skin name? When we were speaking outside the courtroom, you explained to me that you were there working in the big shop until about 1981. You then left and went up to Queensland. You came back to the community in 1992.
Yes.
And you were shocked
Yes.
because there was petrol sniffing, and you had never seen that prior to that time.
Yes.
So what was that like? What did you see? How did it become evident to you?
So I have flashback memories of that period of time, I remember seeing the community itself was a mess. There was rubbish all the way up the fences in the streets, and kids were walking around with their arms around each other, and they had little tin cans with little holes with string, so they were held by the string, and so they were just walking around the community sniffing. It was heartbreaking.
Did that affect how you connected with the community?
It did, and I left. I never came back to the community for 20 years after that.
So, just Please take your time, and Paddy's going to give you some water.
And I actually forgot those memories. I forgot them. And it wasn't until I went back to Yuendamu 20 years later that those memories started coming back into my head and I was remembering them.
When you first went there in 1992, was there any program available for those?
I don't know. I didn't go there I just went there to visit a little Aboriginal girl that I had looked after when she was a baby.
Ms. Chilvers, I'm about to ask you about Kumanjayi, and one of the things you say in your statement, the very first statement that you did, you've known him since he was 12 years of age.
Yes.
You've known him you came to know him because of the various roles that you've held
Yes.
in professional positions in Central Australia, and you knew him right up until very shortly before he passed away.
Yes.
And you've obviously come to know a lot of young people through your work, but you had a particular connection with Kumanjayi. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, there's a couple, but particularly Kumanjayi.
You've got long-standing connections with his family,
Yes.
both on mum's side, the Lane family, and dad's side, the Walker family.
Yes.
And you've also got a long-standing connection with the Brown family.
Yes.
And you note that Leanne Oldfield, who he called mum, had a particular important role that you pay respect to in your statement. So his life and his tragic passing has had a profound impact on you.
Yes.
If you need to stop for a break at any time when I'm asking you these questions, please let us know. How did you first come to know him? What are your first memories?
My first memory was when I was in the role of Mount Theo Outstation Coordinator and working for Waubra Youth Development Aboriginal Corporation, and we were hosting the 20-year celebrations of the Mount Theo program, and Kumanjayi was there.
And I'll just put some dates around that. You were the Mount Theo Outstation Coordinator for WIDAC from January 2013 through to June 2015.
Correct.
And there was the 20-year anniversary during that time.
It was in August 2013.
Okay. So Mount Theo, you would have come to know then the history of Mount Theo as an outstation.
Yes.
For that purpose. Had you met Andrew Stojnovski, also known as Yakajiri, prior to that time?
Who is present in the room today. I want to acknowledge him. Yeah, I hadn't. We'd met, but it was a very busy time at that time. So we had kind of met. We knew who each other were, but we had never had a real conversation.
You came to know that Yakajiri and a significant number of Yapa had been involved in
Yes.
the outstation earlier.
Yes.
The Yapa who were involved, they were at their 20-year anniversary as well, I take it.
Yes.
And did you have relationships with them prior to coming to run that?
No. No, I was mostly connected with the Ngalia Walbury group, so South Camp Mob.
Okay.
I went to school with Jean Brown. We went on school trips together to Uluru, so I knew them as young people. And I remember Peggy Brown was a cleaner at the school when my mum was teaching there, so I would have known them, but I didn't know them well.
So when you took up that role from January 2013 to June 2015, did you take it over from somebody?
A lady by the name of Amelia was running it before I was there. I don't think it had been running effectively because there'd been a lot of community disruption in a couple of years prior, and the community was still recovering from that.
Okay. In your statement, you set out what your work history is and what led up to you taking on these positions. I just want to note then, in terms of your history, you began practicing as a psychologist in December 1998.
Yes.
At the Alcohol, Tobacco and Other Drug Services in Townsville.
Yes.
And you did that role until May 2001.
Yep.
From 2003 to April 2004, you practiced as a counsellor and psychologist at the Gympie Women and District Health Centre in Gympie.
Yes.
And you had worked as a psychologist in private practice, or you later worked as a psychologist in private practice from 2008 to 2011. So by the time you become the Mount Theo Outstation Coordinator in January 2013. You've had significant amount of experience as a counsellor and psychologist.
Yeah.
So to perform that role as the Outstation Coordinator, where were you based?
My husband and daughter and myself were based in Yuendamu.
And what are your first memories of Kumanjayi during that period?
On the January celebrations was, oh my God, I hope this kid never comes to Mount Theo. He was running wild.
You say that in your statement, you'd held the position for 8 months because you started in January.
Yeah.
The celebrations for the 20 years were in August. And prior to the August event, you'd coordinated 3 Mount Theo runs,
Yeah.
a 1-week camp with a group of 8 young people, a 3-month program for 4 young males, and a 6-week program for 8 young people.
Yeah.
At that time, in spite of your experience as a counsellor and psychologist, you did not have the developmental trauma training?
Correct.
When you, just before I ask you again about Kumanjayi, when you describe those different experiences, there's a 1-week camp is an option for some, and then a 3-month program an option for others. So did it vary depending on the needs of the young people?
I think it varied more depending on the staff capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you were out there in 2013 to 2015,
Yeah.
who were the key Yapa staff assisting?
Rex Forrest, who's also in the room here today, SM, they call Jabananga SM, and Paul Marshall Jabananga were the primary kind of like carers. And then there were Eddie and Lottie who would attend quite regularly, and then the elder crew, which was the old ladies, so, and then old Jabangari.
When you first met Kumanjayi, this is how you describe him in your statement. He was 12 at the time. His behaviour was what you considered then to be out of control.
Yeah.
He was running around the building playing games with other young people. He wouldn't listen to you and he wouldn't listen to Yapa, is that right? And you remember thinking to yourself, I hope he doesn't come out here because I don't know how I would manage that behaviour.
Correct.
Were there other young people in that position as well, or did Kumanjayi really stand out?
Kumanjayi really stood out. Yeah.
Do you remember at the time speaking to Yapa about him and why he was behaving like that?
No, we was busy.
Okay.
Yeah.
In early March 2014, Kumanjayi was 13. He came to the Mount Theo Outstation for the first time as a program participant.
Yes.
How long was the program that you was going on?
It was either 4 or 5 weeks.
And you explained your first interactions with him as part of that program. He was in the back of the troopy with some other young people. When you arrived at Mount Theo, you opened the back of the troopy to let him and the others get out. Everybody else got out, and Kumanjayi didn't. What was it? What was he doing?
He was seated in a fetal position in the car, in the troopy, and he wouldn't move and he wouldn't speak.
And did you understand at all what was going on for him at that time?
I didn't understand. I was surprised by that behaviour. It was like, I don't understand, because we'd taken lots of kids out there by then, and as soon as you get there, the first thing they want to do is jump out and run around but he didn't move. He stayed.
And was there family for Kumanjayi out there at the time?
His grandmother, and he is connected. Yes, there was. Yes.
And did Yapa come and speak to him?
They did.
And were they able to coax him out of the
No.
car? What happened eventually in terms of getting him out?
So it got dark, and I kept coming back and just checking in on him, and speaking kindly to him, and then we'd cook dinner, and he must have been hungry, and I just came back and I said, "Come on, mate, we got dinner. Come on, it'll be all right." And he hopped out, and he was all right after that.
Could you speak any Warlpiri?
I can understand more than I can speak.
When you were speaking with Kumanjayi, would you speak English?
English.
What was his ability to understand like?
He can understand.
And when he came out then and he he was actually able to communicate when he came out.
He
for
didn't
dinner.
really communicate much. Yeah, he just came out, and he ate and was there.
Over the period of time, that 5 weeks or so, he did settle in.
Yes.
Did he come to communicate?
Yes. We spent lots of wonderful moments together. Yeah, we had a lot of fun, and I got to know him. I feel blessed.
You explain in your statement that in terms of his behaviour in the troopy, you didn't understand it then, but you do understand it now
Yes.
as being in a state of dorsal vagal shutdown.
Yes.
Can you tell us what that means?
So, when human beings are so overwhelmed, they will shut down, and that was what that was to me. And Deb Dana refers to that state as basically being scared to death. So
it's a freeze.
it's a freeze response.
And is it a trauma response?
Yes, it is.
Do you know, in that moment when he was in the back of the troopy, of course nothing externally, as far as we can see, is happening to him that's traumatic, but
No.
what is being triggered there for him? What was then?
It was a new environment for him, and I'm not sure if Leanne was in community, but Leanne wasn't with him, and Leanne was his main stability, so his primary connection, I would say. So it was just overwhelming for him.
Over that 5 weeks or so, then you say he settled. You would spend on average 5 days and 4 nights a week at the outstation, and a lot of your time there was spent interacting with Kumanjayi.
Yeah, and the other young people there.
And you describe him as being mostly well behaved.
Very well behaved, to my surprise.
He engaged in all one-on-one programs. What sort of programs would you do with him one-on-one?
So we were doing a little bit of schooling. We had some sheets from the school, so a bit of education. We were just, I did a couple of little assessments on him. I did the Westerman's Aboriginal Symptom Checklist for Youth, and he was most fascinated by the learning style assessment that I did. He really was quite interested in it, and he understood himself to be auditory, preferring auditory. So, talking, story, listening, it was his way of learning. And he demonstrated that he was able to learn when in that structured, safe environment.
We understand that Kumanjayi had some difficulties at school. How does that environment compare to school? Why would he be able to respond positively to you there and not at school?
Well, when he was there, I think we only had 3 other young people there, and they were a little bit older than him. I think in the school context, it's too stimulating, and so he would be distracted. And also because of his emotional immaturity, he was teased a lot. And, kids used to have fun teasing him because he would react. And, yeah, so school wasn't... He would have been too hyper-aroused to be able to actually concentrate and learn at school.
You also refer to some group activities that he participated in, including culturally based activities.
Yeah.
And he was able to do that with the other kids?
Yeah. I remember taking them out to... there's a soakage out near Mount Theo. It's called Bwadi Bwadi, and we would go out there because it was hot. We would go out there for swims. There was a lot of water there at the time, and there was some little duckies there, and all the kids were playing with the little duckies, and Kumanjayi was very, very gentle with them. He came to show me in the car, and he was really gentle with these little duckies. And then, of course, the duckies were stressed from being handled, and one of them did pass away, and he dug a little grave and buried it and made it all pretty.
So you were out there on your own. I withdraw that. You were out there with Yucca staff, of course. And during that 5-week period, would you say that, what was the difference between him from the start to the finish?
Well, the start, him being in a freeze state, to on the front of my reporter shared a picture with permission from Leanne to share that picture of him and being a happy young boy.
We've got that picture here. Is it appropriate if I show that picture to?
With Leanne's permission, is it all right with you, Samara? Yeah. Thank you.
Then I'll just ask Jess if she would put that up. That's at page 1 of the document called Trauma Informed Assessment and Recommendations. It's page 10 of Ms. Chilver's statement of the 28th of November.
So this is how I know him.
So he's 13 there,
Yeah.
Ms. Chilvers. And where are you there?
We're at Mount Theo. And he's digging a hole to plant a orange tree. And they had to dig the hole big enough to fit the flower bucket in it.
So that's obviously a beautiful photo and a happy memory.
Yeah.
Was that how you remember him being?
That's how I
during the
remember
fight?
him. Yeah.
That can come down now, Jess. Thank you. You say that although he was childlike in his level of maturity, he functioned well in that relatively safe environment.
Yeah.
He was definitely different to the other young people that came to the art
Yes.
session. In what way?
Just in his emotional maturity and I guess his reactivity to when being teased.
At that stage, were you aware of any background he had in terms of substance abuse, either his own use or his parents' use when he was in utero?
He shared with me during that period that he had witnessed substance abuse, and he'd been exposed to substance abuse and witnessing family violence.
You say in your statement that across the 7 years that you knew him, and even back to that early time, he definitely presented with what you are now able to recognise as symptoms of trauma. Is that
Yes.
right? And that includes hyperarousal, difficulty sleeping, irritability, outbursts of anger that triggered often by him being teased, difficulty concentrating, he was distracted, hyperactive, hypervigilant, poor impulse control, and an exaggerated startle response.
Yeah.
What's that last one? Can you explain what happens there?
So it's like when animals do it too, like, humans and animals, if a threat appears, we go like that. That's a startle response. That's our first biological response to threat. And then we move to orienting, which is looking around, checking for is there danger? And then once we've assessed that there's no danger, our systems will calm back down again. But sometimes kids and adults who have experienced significant trauma, they're kind of stuck like this a little bit. And through somatic experiencing, you have to work with those nervous systems to help them to come out of that startle response.
What is somatic experiencing?
Somatic experiencing is a body-based trauma recovery modality developed by Peter Levine, and it understands trauma from a nervous system perspective, and so we work with people's nervous systems. So it's different to counselling. We don't talk story, what happened to you. That's not really what's important. What's important is what's going on in your nervous system.
So you speak during the course of your outline of evidence about getting Kumanjayi to breathe and to notice his breathing.
Yes.
Is that part of that somatic
Yes.
experience?
Yes. So that part is interoception. It's helping people to become aware of what's going on inside of their body so that they are actually able to learn how to manage their own responses.
And I'll come back to that because I want to talk about Kumanjayi's experience with his hands. If you had known back then when he was just 13 that this was a trauma response, would you have done anything differently in terms of working with him?
I would have done a lot differently, yeah.
What Miss Chilvers would you have been able to do?
I wished I had the knowledge I have now back then, yeah. I just, I would have done like in my report, I do a proposed treatment plan. That's what I would have done.
Those words, trauma-informed response and trauma-informed training, it's a relatively new concept for workers here in Australia. Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair.
When did you start to develop that or to understand that as part of your training?
Well, it was because of the anomalies that Kumanjayi particularly presented me with that I got curious about what's going on here, what's happening here. I want to understand this. And so I started learning about trauma and I've been learning about trauma ever since.
So you reference a particular book, The Body Keeps Score.
Yeah.
And the name of that author?
Bessel van der Kolk, yeah.
And was that really the beginning of the development of an understanding?
That was, yes.
You note that, unfortunately, back then it was the White Act's policy that once a young person had completed their time at Mount Theo and returned to the community, your involvement with them stopped as the Mount Theo coordinator.
Yes.
What's the impact of, well, I'll go back a step. Did you develop a relationship with Kumanjayi during those 5 weeks?
Yes.
Would you ideally then continue to have a relationship with the young people when they leave the art station?
That would be ideal. I certainly did, but not in my work role. All of the young people that attended Mount Theo when I was there, I've been watching ever since. I can tell you where most of them are.
And have you tried to maintain contact with them wherever possible? This might sound like a very obvious question, but for somebody like Kumanjayi who had experienced what he had done throughout his life, what's the significance of being able to maintain the connection?
So important in healing trauma. Relationships are key. So important, that continuity of care.
It's a particular challenge in the Northern Territory where we have a workforce that is more transient.
Which is why we need a local workforce.
Why Yapa need to be trained.
Correct.
Can I just come now to the SevGen connection? You note in your statement, mid-2014, early 2015, your role at WIDAC expanded to include outreach work and case coordination.
Yeah, so I created the outreach counsellor position. So I established that position.
And during that time, at some point, Kumanjayi went into youth detention and you were able to get involved in his case again.
Yeah.
You then advocated along with others to have him be able to attend the SevGen program.
Yes.
He was there for 6 months in a structured, supportive, loving environment.
Yes.
It was away from country. It was in Queensland.
Yes.
Did you go and visit him during that time?
No.
Were you getting regular reports back? Who was that through?
From Terry Waller and from Leanne.
And you note in your statement, not only did he stay out of trouble in Queensland at SevGen, but he also remained out of trouble when he came back to Yuendamu for a significant period.
Yes.
What is it then about the SevGen program that enables that success?
He was his self-identity as a Warlpiri young man was really valued, and he got to share his culture with other kids, like Aboriginal kids from Queensland. He shared his culture, so he had that sense of pride. He was also able to engage in a lot of activities. He learned how to surf or did some surfing. And he also was, they had an art gallery, and he was the one who decided where the pictures would go. So he was treated with utmost respect culturally and as a human being. And he had Leanne with him.
Is there any program like that, to your knowledge, operating in Central Australia?
Not to my knowledge.
Would it be possible for a program?
Yes.
What would it take? What would it look like if you were designing it?
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah, I think Children's Ground does a really good model, has a really good model here in the Northern Territory as well.
Is Children's Ground somewhere where young people can go and stay for 6 months at
No.
a time? Do you think that it's necessary to have that long-term,
Yes, I do.
culturally informed
Yes, I do.
place available?
Yes, I do.
And can I suggest to you, if you were doing it ideally, it wouldn't just be one place located away from country, there would be a number of places close to country that young people could go?
Like my most recent thoughts are, it's like, Mount Theo is only for certain young people. It's
Yes.
not for all young people. And when I was most recently working with Waidak, I purchased a off-road camper van, and my thoughts were, as part of the youth diversion program, was actually to have, instead of taking a bunch of kids somewhere, you take the kid and the family and you take them on their country, and you take elders with you and you stay on country for a period of time. And then it also needs that, I think, trauma specialist input into designing the activities that help the brain redevelop. And that can be cultural activities like tool making, anything that's really rhythmic and just surrounding that person with love.
Some of the training that you have done involves culturally informed training,
Yes.
trauma training, is that right? Who's that delivered by?
So I've done numerous, but the most significant one, the one that I think you're referring to, is a postgraduate certificate in trauma Indigenous recovery practices. So that is using Indigenous healing practices.
And where was that taught through?
Through the University of Wollongong.
Through the University of Wollongong.
Wollongong, yes.
One of the reasons we have heard for Mount Theo being successful at different periods of time is the involvement of Yapa, particularly Yapa elders and other younger people, in designing it and then delivering that program.
Yeah.
You said it wasn't for everybody.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, some families don't want their kids to go to that country because it's not their country.
Sure. So it just underscores what you just said, doesn't it? That you need then another place or other places where it is appropriate country for the family group. Is
Yeah,
that
so
right?
you just need some four-wheel drive mobile facilities. They can go anywhere.
In going through a chronology with Kumanjayi, after that period of time in SevGen when he came back, March 2016, you changed roles. You were a case coordinator, program facilitator with the Tangeri Domestic Violence Specialist Children's Service.
Yes.
That involved case coordination and psychoeducational support for Aboriginal young people who were impacted by domestic violence,
Yes.
or experiencing domestic violence, and included working with young people who were using violence in their relationships.
Yes.
Did you come to work with Kumanjayi at all as
I
a
did.
result of that role?
I did.
And where was he based during that time?
He was at the youth centre, the youth detention centre in Alice Springs.
So at that stage, were you able to work with him in any therapeutic way based on his trauma?
There is no capacity at the youth centre, at the youth detention centre at that time to do therapeutic work. So I would go and visit him and I'd be shoved in this little horrible room with him, and yeah, it was horrible, but I did the best that I could.
Are you aware of whether that situation has changed at all?
Well, I would hope so. They've just spent millions and millions of dollars on redesigning the youth detention centre. I'm not sure that they were, I know they were prioritising educational facilities. I'm not sure what their intentions were with regards to therapeutic services at the detention. I would hope so.
There are obviously limits to what therapy can be provided within a detention centre, but what is best practice as far as you're concerned in terms of allowing a practitioner like you to deliver therapy?
to have a soft room, like, you know, to be able to have a soft room that's comfortable, that is just a nice space to be in, to allow the nervous system to kind of relax, and of course to have privacy and free from, like, you know, people walking past and banging noises.
You visited Kumanjayi on a number of occasions in the detention centre, and you note in your statement he surprised you with his ability to articulate what the effects of violence were on other people.
Yes.
I'll come to the assessment that you did on Kumanjayi and some traumas that he experienced and what the impact was. But in terms of his ability to empathise and show insight, was that...
He had extreme levels of remorse.
You did a particular diagram with Kumanjayi where you said he was able to understand the cycle of violence and also able to talk about what was going on for him in terms of his body and how he experienced emotions.
He wasn't able to talk
I
about
see.
that. Yeah.
Okay.
He was
So-
able to talk about the cognitive, like, he was able to talk about the impacts of violence on his partner, on family members, on children witnessing, so he could see through their eyes and he could report. But when it came to what was going on inside you, that's where it stopped.
So I might ask Jess if you could put this diagram up, and it's from Ms. Chilver's first statement. It's 8-10. It's the statement of... How do you have to... It is the statement from 2020, 17. Oh, great, okay. And if you could have a look, please, at paragraph 6.6.
So I've done this activity. I was facilitating the men's behaviour change program for Kumanjayi for a period of time, and I've done this activity with many of the men. And so it's like a body map, and you just ask them to explain or describe what's going on inside their body when they're feeling angry or wild or about to use violence. And most of the men, they'll put like steam blowing out their ears and hot head, and they'll have their heart racing, and they'll have all of this energy happening in their bodies. And that was what Kumanjayi, that's not his actual drawing, but that is a recreation of his drawing, of what he put. And all he was able to sense into was his hands. It was energy in his hands, which told me that he had no capacity for interoception. So as we have perception on the outside that allows us to see outside, we have interoception, which helps us to connect with what's going on inside of us. That was missing, and that is not uncommon in people who've experienced significant early developmental trauma.
So at that time, after that time, you attempted to do some breathing exercise for him. And what can you tell us about that?
So again, he was always a source of great learning for me. It was like I asked him, when you breathe in, can you feel the breath coming into your body? I wanted him to show me on the outside of his body where he could feel the breathing coming into, and he couldn't sense the breath coming into his body. So I said, can you blow out onto your hand like that? So he would do that, and he could feel the breath on his hand, but he had it was going to be a long journey to teach him how to be able to use his breath to calm his nervous system.
And by that time in 2016, had you become aware of trauma-informed practice?
I had started to, yes. I had started my learning journey.
One of the things you note is that Kumanjayi escaped from youth detention 3 times.
Yes.
And on one of those occasions, he had been placed into hospital with multiple dog bites as a result of the arrest. And not long after that, his mum, Leanne Oldfield, one of his mums, rang you distraught, wanting you to help Kumanjayi hand himself in. And you remember thinking to yourself, how could he escape again when he'd just been through this terrible trauma?
Yeah.
What does that tell you about what was going on for him?
That tells me that his need to escape was greater than anything else. There was something significant going on for him. It also tells me that that part of his brain in the limbic system that is connected to, that we have, that, oh, well, last time I did that, this is what happened, that wasn't working at that time. He was not thinking about what happened last time when he was only in that moment when he just made that call to escape again.
And you describe that as likely to be him having a recognition that he has frontal lobe damage?
Yes.
Cognitive impairment.
Yes, there's a disconnection between memory and consequences, planning, thinking about the consequences.
So I might just come now to the diagnosis that you've been able to do based on your understanding of Kumanjayi.
So I have to qualify that.
Sure.
It is a clinical impression. Complex developmental trauma is not yet recognised by the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual as being a actual diagnosis.
Okay.
And I'm glad for that because it's not a mental illness. It's a neurological disruption.
Well, that is extremely helpful for you to help us clarify, because understanding it as a neurological issue rather than a mental illness helps structure the appropriate therapy. Is
Yes,
that right?
that's right.
So you refer to this in your most recent statement, dated the 28th of November. And I just want to show you a particular page from it. Of course, Ms. Chilvers, we've got this whole statement and it's in great detail. I'll just get Jess to put that up on the screen. That's the 28th of November. And if you turn please to page 10, which is the page we saw with the photo of Kumanjayi. And Ms. Chilvers, as I understand it, you say this is what you would have liked to have done soon after you met Kumanjayi, so that you had a full understanding of what he was experiencing.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, sorry.
This trauma-informed assessment and recommendations.
Oh, yes.
And it's in front of you on the screen as well.
Yes.
So a summary of your key impressions and diagnosis for Kumanjayi is a complex developmental disorder.
Complex developmental trauma.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And that's the clinical impression that was formed by by yourself.
Yeah.
Does that fit with what you understand to have been a diagnosis for him in 2017?
It does. It's not. It's different. I think that diagnosis just only talks to the cognitive, so that frontal lobe impairment. Whereas I'm looking at it through a trauma lens from a nervous system and brainstem, limbic brain impairment.
So you then go on to note the other part of your impression of diagnosis is intellectual disability, intellectual developmental disorder of mild to moderate severity, and that's the diagnosis of
That's
Kate,
the diagnosis of Kate Crawley.
which you adopt effectively.
I agree with that.
You provide a definition of complex developmental
Should be
trauma. I think it does say trauma.
Yeah.
So if you have a look,
The next page.
paragraph 2.1, that's it there. If you wouldn't mind just reading that out.
Sure. Complex developmental trauma is defined as exposure to multiple traumatic events that occur within family and community systems that are chronic and begin in early childhood. And it's important to continue to say the impact of which is greater than it is for any other type of trauma because it occurs within the context of family and community, which is systems that are meant to provide a source of safety, support and stability for children.
So it shakes the foundations for
It shakes the foundations neurodevelopmentally.
The key defining features of complex developmental trauma, as opposed to other forms of trauma, proposed by, that's the author we referred to earlier, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps Score, and then you set those out in Table 1.
Yes.
One of the issues there is persistent altered attributions and expectations, a loss of trust in social agencies to protect.
Yes.
Is that something that's important for people who are working with those who've experienced trauma to understand?
Yes.
That there'll be a need to take extra care to build some trust?
Yes.
Is it possible
Yes.
to build trust?
Yes.
I'm just going to go to appreciating that you've spent all that time setting that out and that that's available to Her Honour. I'm going to ask you to focus specifically in relation to Kumanjayi, and if you look at page 18, there's a chart there which refers to some experiences. So it's the one that's labelled
This one?
page 18 at the top. That's the one.
Yes.
Is that meant to indicate various issues that Kumanjayi experienced?
Yes.
So you obviously set these out, and you made a point of saying how much respect you have for Kumanjayi's family. There's no criticism involved, but the fact that he experienced these issues as a young child meant that that it was extremely difficult for him throughout his life.
Yes.
Is that right? In terms of the adverse childhood experiences, they include prenatal exposure to substances and parental substance abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, prolonged exposure to domestic violence and substance abuse, disconnected from his maternal family, and the fact that he was bullied and teased by other young people, including family. He was called Waranga, Mad One. Is it the case that if you're working with a young person and their family, the whole family needs to understand
Yes.
what the young person's experiencing,
Yes.
so that you can stop that teasing?
Yeah. Yeah. At the outstation, there was one of the other members out there was teasing him, and he got upset, and I growled that other young fella. He didn't speak to me for 3 days. But we have a respectful relationship to this day. And he became, he used to always come back out and want to work at Mount Theo all of the time. I think he's still offering to work at Mount Theo. So, yeah.
In terms of the impact on the brainstem functioning, that's set out in the next box. High base level parasympathetic nervous system activation, that's the shutdown, the freezing.
Yeah. And dissociation. So dissociation is that disconnection from his body. So like a disconnection from the felt sense of the body.
So in terms, does that relate to the diagram with the hands?
Yes.
Poor affect regulation, what does that mean?
Poor affect regulation means an inability to regulate his emotions or even his brainstem, like his arousal system.
Hypervigilance, hyperactivity, impulsivity, automatic flight, escape or response to threat. If he's thwarted, he'll resort to fight.
Yes.
How does that relate back to his trauma?
Well, we all have innate survival responses, and I wish I could show you a snowman video. You can see people, there's like a snowman, and he's in a snowman little thing, and he's standing really still, and when people walk past, he goes, he moves, and he goes like that. And human beings respond differently. They will either respond with fight, some will come out punch the snowman, some will come out like a gazelle, they'll do a big leap, they'll do a flight, and some will just either freeze or they will collapse to the ground.
I think I've seen that video.
Yeah, it's very hilarious.
So some people get a genuine fright, other people find it funny, other people respond with anger in response to being frightened.
And that's just their initial nervous system survival response.
So what you're saying is that for somebody who's experienced trauma from a very young child, like was set out in that first box, there's a particular response, and that includes automatic flight, wanting to escape to...
Well, that's for Kumanjayi. So other people might respond differently.
I see.
Yeah, so Kumanjayi's primary survival response was flight, which means that he would run away. He would try to avoid or escape the situation. That was his primary response. And then what I mean by thwart that, if you prevent him from being able to run away, he's left with only fight. That's what he's left with as a survival response.
And then is the next step that shutdown,
Yes.
freeze?
Yes. Yes. So I can tell you that, you know, in 9/11, where the people that were on some of those buildings up there that made the decision to jump out of those buildings, they would have been passed out before they hit the ground. They would have been. The nervous system just can't cope with that level of stress, and it has this survival response of shutdown to self-preserve.
If you're a trauma-informed caseworker out at Mount Theo working with Kumanjayi, is it important to understand what he's going to experience in terms of
Yes.
confronting him?
Yes.
So, for example, you wouldn't want to dress up in a scary outfit and scare him.
No.
And if you wanted to get him into a car to go somewhere with you, is there a particular strategy that you would adopt for him, knowing that those experiences that he's had?
Yes.
What would that be?
It would be kindness and gentleness and walking side by side with him.
If you're a police officer coming to detain Kumanjayi for a particular thing, do you think it's important to understand
Absolutely.
those issues? What approach would you recommend if you were advising police who needed to detain him on a warrant?
I would have recommended that they did the opposite of what they did. I would have recommended that they went through Derek Williams, they went through the local police who had a relationship with Kumanjayi, and that they went through family. And he would have come peacefully.
In terms of trying to minimise the risk of harm to him and to others,
Yes.
is that important?
That's very important. That's what trauma-informed practice is, minimising the harm to the person and to others, and including the police themselves and staff themselves.
I'm going to show you a video now of the arrest of Kumanjayi leading up to him, so I just want to give a warning about
Thank
that.
you.
We'll stop that, hopefully before there's any fatal shot fired, but it's really just to ask you about the approach. I'm grateful the video's been edited, so that will happen. So I'll just ask you to watch this now. This is the body-worn video from Constable Rolfe.
Have you seen this
I have.
before?
Yeah, we'll need the sound. It's not going to keep on.
You know, for a start there, if I may, I just think like to be walking through with guns like that when there's little children around that's traumatising for those little children that witness that.
Sorry, I want to come back to that because you've got that document here, adverse childhood experiences, and I want to find out a little bit more about that.
Yes.
There's obviously family exposure, but we're also talking about community exposure, and we're also talking about responsibility of everyone living, working and exposing themselves to children, particularly children who are likely to already have adverse childhood experiences,
Yes.
the responsibility they have
Yes.
in relation to not contributing.
Yes.
And there might be another video that we want to play in relation to that as well. We've got a difficulty with the sound. Do we need to adjourn so that you can fix that up?
I can share another story with you at the detention centre of a video clip that I witnessed. It wasn't in relation to Kumanjayi, but it was another young traumatised person. And the youth officers wanted him to be moved from this room over here to this room over here. And so what they did was the 5 of them stood out to the door. They were standing in a semicircle around the open door. And so this kid had that's like enclosing him and caging him in. So his response to that was to barge through them.
And you think there's an ability to give those people trauma-informed training, which would mean that they step back
Yes.
and minimise the risk?
Yes. So, they could have stood away from the doorway and moved around so that he didn't feel so threatened, and he would have been able to, there was nowhere he could go, so he could have just walked out and they could have had the other door open and he would have more than likely just walked over into the other room. But it created an incident for which he was punished. That's not fair.
Is that a convenient time to take a short break to try and fix the technology?
Thank you.
Yes.
All stand.
Thank you for the water.
Yeah.